Casser-Jayne, and welcome to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a podcast akin to the great salons of times past. Pour yourself a martini, grab a spot on your favorite sofa, and listen to the great artists, writers, politicians, and celebrities of our day discuss and debate the current political and economic scene, art and music, film, literature, or maybe talk about the newest trends in fashion, design, and haute cuisine. Whether it's the current political cocktail or the latest must-read award-winning book, we tackle all topics and like to stir and sometimes shake things up. On this episode of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, we're all things politics with Podcast America, our weekly politics segment in which veteran White House correspondent Matthew Cooper and I slice and dice the current political landscape. And in our second half hour, you won't want to miss noted former New York Times editorial board editor Andrew Rosenthal, who will introduce his new book, The New York Times Book of Politics. Stay tuned, and let's get to it. As we do every week, newsman Matthew Cooper joins me for our politics segment, Podcast America. And what a week it's been. The blue wave is real. Democrats continue to rack up House seats. Florida remains dysfunctional Florida, as a recount was ordered in both the governor and Senate races. Trump ousted Attorney General Jeff Sessions and replaced him with the WWE-like loyalist Matthew Whitaker. Trump had a hissy fit in Paris where it drizzles. The Robert Mueller investigation continues on. Then First Lady Melania Trump also had a fit. Nancy Pelosi is fighting for her speakership. And we are just beginning. So here we go. My friend Matt. Hello, darling.
Hello, Halli.
720 days, 5 hours, 54 minutes, 21 seconds to the next election in 2020. I thought we could have a break, but everybody's talking that stupid election like, I'm so exhausted. I'm absolutely exhausted from listening to them, but we're not really going to go there. I just thought I'd have some fun with that.
I think that's good.
Okay. Yeah. But we are going to talk about this. Blue wave, blue roll. When you and I left, it was the night of the election. Lots happened since then, and I'm thinking blue rolling wave. What are you thinking?
Yeah, well, bluer than when we talked last because, the late counting tended to go more Democratic. And, I think you can safely call it a wave.
I think so, too. And I think I think we're at 38 House seats now, seven governor's mansions. That's pretty darn good. But I think it's where
absolutely.
They hit that's really interesting. Let's talk just Arizona for one. That one just happened. Kirsten Sinema. I said there's a new cinema in town. Wonk, wonk.
I like that. Well, I think she's a fascinating figure, bisexual, openly bisexual, centrist. Not a lefty, and I think will cut a compelling figure in the Senate. So that was very. That's a very interesting one.
I liked her because what happened, it was Flake's seat, and it was up because he was kind of pushed out. Thank you, President Trump.
Right.
And he got nailed, Trump. That wasn't the only one he got nailed at, by the way. There were 3 of them, right?
Right.
Talk about that.
Yeah. You mean the other Senate seats?
Yeah, because I think it's interesting. Yeah. I mean, he lost them.
Yeah, well, there's no question. I mean, Jackie Rosen was a big win for Democrats in Nevada, so she'll be an interesting figure. We'll see what happens to your Bill Nelson down in Florida.
Oh God, we'll talk about that in a second. But who was the other one? The guy, Montana, right? He tried to get him out.
He held the seat. On, John Tester, and of course, a lot of ones that they thought were going to at one time thought were vulnerable. Won by a lot. For instance, Tammy Baldwin won by 10 points in Wisconsin.
Yeah. So it makes you wonder.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, Matt. I'm going to say this, and let's see what you say back. Which is, I'm starting to feel political instincts, that Trump is losing it a little. It's starting to reverse itself. you start to see a little bit of trends, certainly in that Midwest place or whatever. But I think all the way around, something's not right with old Trump baby. I think the chickens may be starting to gently come home to roost. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't make any early bets on his reelection, but I think there's no question he's not, he's not super popular. Democrats are fired up, and that showed all over the map. And you got Democratic governor of Kansas, right? And
that's amazing. Yeah.
They may pull off the seat in Utah. So
Yeah, I think it's all. I'm going to say he's gonna start to take it on the chin more and more and more and more and more. Before we go to Florida, let's just go to Stacey Abrams real quickly, because It's a setup for Florida in a way. That story with Kemp, and he did everything, as Attorney General and as candidate to, squelch the vote. And she's winning in court cases. I mean, they're letting her do a recount now, right? So I think that's a good thing. I don't see how she pulls the numbers off. Do you?
It seems hard. It's a pretty big gap. I think it was in the 50,000 or something like that. Maybe I'm mistaken, but it seemed a little hard to pull off in a recount. But you never know what ballots had been written off. So
or found, or they find.
Or they find. So, keep watching that space. It seems, tougher there than Florida.
It does. But the reason I wanted to bring it up is because everybody made such noise about Kemp, and he really was horrendous, and he really was playing some nasty games, and we'll see what actually happens as we go forward. But the last person I would have thought would do that, which is absolutely naive on my part, is Rick Scott, to start to play that crap. Who is Rick Scott? Matt, who? The guy who ran and the guy who he is,
yeah, well, I guess it's just in the culture of Florida, right? They play hardball in these recounts and just claw and do whatever you can. And he seems to be doing that with...
All right, so let's set it up. The vote is very close between Scott and help me, and Nelson. I think it's 12,000 votes at this point. Right. Nobody's ever recovered and won a recount on the 12,000 votes. But then there was that really weird thing that happened, 34,000 undervotes?
Yeah.
Explain that to the audience, because that's interesting.
Well, it struck, everyone statistically that there were, big concentrations of voters who voted for governor and other races, but they didn't vote in the Senate race. And,
in a Democratic county.
In Democratic County, and they think it was owing to a crappy ballot, to a poorly constructed ballot, which, as you'll remember, is part of what happened in Florida in 2000. So, that's one of the issues here. There's not a lot you can do about that if people haven't filled in the ballot.
But then there's this electronics thing, and that I think it was in Volusia County, and don't quote me on that, but it was one of the northern counties where they found that when they were doing the recount, they were shy of something like 12,000 votes as they're running the thing through the machines. And lo and behold, exactly what their fear, what Nelson hopes happened in Broward County with those 34,000 is what happened on the recount in, I think it was Volusia, and I may be wrong. It was a Republican stronghold, and they went back and they ran it, and the second time it picked up the right count, matching the original count. So there is something with those machines that I think is really quite extraordinary. It's why do we do these? Why do we vote like this in America? I think should have both. I think you should have to have a written ballot, and you should have to have an electronic ballot.
Yeah, I did the paper ballot up here in D.C.
Okay. Yeah. But that's what I think. Yeah, but I think we should have to do both. And then there can't be any second guessing on what's going on. I do want to tell people who this Rick Scott is, though, because most likely he'll become the senator. This is a bad man. The Republicans, we talked about it last week, they voted so many people in who were indicted, that's their thing. But do you know the story about him? He was the CEO of Columbia HCA about a decade ago, right? And the company was fined $1.7 billion from Medicare fraud. All right, which all started when he was at the head of the CEO thing in the day, and he stepped down rather than, but they took it on the chin. What did I say? What the fine? 1.7.
1.7. You said
billion for Medicare fraud, and then Republicans in Florida elected him twice. And there are all sorts of stories that went on all through the campaign about he and his wife and, offshore, and they didn't really have blind trusts, and they were building the railroad in Florida, and they're the money behind the railroad. This is not a good guy. So I said, and I'm curious, I said, he shouldn't be a senator. He should be in an orange suit, and he should be, going to the pokey, not going to Washington, D.C. So I don't like the way this is all being handled down here at all with him. And I think that Nelson has been really quite, eloquent in all of this. Yeah. Same thing with Gillum.
And Rubio's all over it.
Rubio and I have been doing battle on Twitter. You guys want to have some fun? Go read me and my battle with Rubio.
Oh, nice.
I don't know what his story is.
But he's all in on this.
He's all in. But listen, they're covering up something. Here's my conspiracy theory. Want to hear it?
Sure.
Okay, if they saw the numbers, they had their inner polls, and their inner polls showed that they were going to lose by about 34,000 votes, and then they won. And they knew that this was weird because they saw their own numbers, and that's why they're screaming, ranting, and raving about this, because they think going in, those 34,000 votes really were supposed to go, because that's what their polling showed, that they were going to win by that much.
Interesting. Could be. We'll see. And Gillum, you think Gillum's a goner?
Gillum's a goner.
Yeah.
And in fact, I have to say, I don't like the new governor-elect, but he's been acting like a mensch. He hasn't made the stink that...
he's not acting out.
He's not acting out. And I think the reason is because, that's a hell of a... What is it? What was the differential between the two of them? 35? Maybe more. It's a huge amount. There's no way that they would recover it. But also... I don't think he wants to have to deal with... he's hoping Scott's going to be long gone. Go away. go to Washington. Leave me alone. So anyway, that's a weird story. But people down here are up in arms. That's all that I can tell you. Up in arms. So let's change the subject from that. Let's go into this. I just want to bring up his name because it may be the last time we say it. Jeff Sessions. Ta-ta, Jeff.
Oh, my God. It feels like it was a month ago.
I know. And this character who looks like something out of the WWE, Matthew Whitaker, who was his chief of staff.
This guy.
Who was screwing Sessions, trying to steal his job.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, and he's just, there's a constitutional question about whether he can be appointed to this job. He's got his own background issues. Then he said all these crazy things about the judiciary, questioning Marbury v. Madison, the 230-year-old decision that gave our judiciary its power. I mean, he's really kind of loopy, and
to say the least. Typical Trump.
But he clearly got to Trump, and clearly he's interested in shutting down Mueller. So, the biggest fireworks have yet to happen.
And lawsuit today, right?
Oh, yeah, lawsuit to try to get him out of that job.
And lawsuit brought by...
the state of Maryland, some others there's going to be a lot of litigation about whether he can have the job, and that's before we get to Mueller, so... fasten your seatbelts. Fasten your seatbelts
is right. The reason that I brought that up, and it's somewhere in my notes, and there's so much going on in the head right now. But most of the even the Fox News lawyer pundit types are saying this is not legal what they're doing, and it needs to be fixed. So that'll be really interesting to see. Let's move. We'll go next. Let's talk Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi just briefly. In this respect, and all the Democratic characters are showing up again after 2 years being banished back on the talk show circuit. It's kind of interesting to see some of these characters, come up. Even a little unnerving, Matt, because something, 2 years. It's like we were in another planet 2 years ago. And so when you see some of these characters, they kind of look out of place, like maybe they don't fit in or something. I don't know. Schumer, stays in the same position that he was in, but Pelosi's in the fight for life, right?
Well, I think she's going to be okay. I don't think the challenge is that strong at the moment.
But here's what I do think is interesting. Who was it? Who stormed her office today?
Yeah, well, Ocasio-Cortez, right?
And what did she do? She went in there for climate change legislation. I'm loving the fact that this youngster, and she's in her 20s?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking Grandma Pelosi.
Yeah.
You got 5 kids and you got 50 grandchildren. You can handle this upstart, Ocasio-Cortez. I'm fascinated by that today. The scene was interesting to me. Was it interesting to you?
Oh, very interesting. I mean, to see an incoming member of Congress engaged in a protest at Congress, but I think Pelosi sees the bigger picture, and she knows she's got to give members room to do what they want, and I doubt it really incensed her in any way. I think it was good for the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez brand, and it was okay for Pelosi. I don't think it was any damage done to the incoming speaker.
No, but I don't think there was any of that. I just think that we have a change that's come.
Oh yeah, no question.
Big change.
We got some new characters.
Right, and I think it's a good thing. On their feet. I don't want them to push the Dems too far left because that'll destroy any chance they have for 2020.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's a lot of new music being played in the halls of Congress, and
no question.
that can only be a good thing, right?
Yeah, no. I think it's all brought a lot of energy. But, what's interesting is the power's in the hands of these old warhorses who are going to run committees, like Pete DeFazio, someone nobody's heard of, but is going to have a very powerful role. And, there's a lot of focus on the youngins, but, it's these old saws who are going to have all the clout.
Right. And but they're going to have to... They're going to have to
pay attention.
Yeah, I think so. They're going to have to be malleable because
no, absolutely.
Times are a-changing. There's no question about it. And if they want to be current and not be old like the Trump train is,
absolutely
stodgy and white and angry and bring a new kind of energy, that'll be appealing in and of itself. So as we take the pulse of America this week, anxiety is way down, don't you think?
You mean for Democrats or
for
others?
For Democrats.
Yeah, well, I think, Democrats had fears that they were going into a long, dark night. And, maybe the election wouldn't turn out well. And, we're entering an age of uninterrupted Trumpism. I think people got themselves worked up. And I think there's a lot of relief among Democrats that, in fact, they did quite well.
Palace intrigue. Okay. A lot of it this week. A lot of it in the last 24 hours. Murdoch visited McConnell. And the next day, Fox News went dark on Twitter. Kim went dark. WikiLeaks went dark. Giuliani, Brad Parscale, Jill Stein, National Enquirer followed. Finally, the Drudge Report scrubbed its tweets. I'm just bringing this up, baby. They say that it was because of Tucker Carlson. I don't think that Jill Stein or the National Enquirer necessarily care about Tucker Carlson and all of that, whatever, and then you get on top of that the story last night with Wackadoodle. What's his name? Oh my God, he handed me forever Jerome Corsi. My God, I letter after letter from him to come on the show, and he goes on and he does this thing and says, it's Mueller time for him, and he's going to jail. All of this. So we're back to Mueller, but what do you think is going on here?
Your guess is as good as mine. I don't know. I wish I could say I had a profound insight into that, but I just don't know.
It is odd, though.
It is odd. It is odd.
Yeah, it's odd.
I mean, I do think Trump, if he's going to make a move on Mueller, it's probably better to do it now than later, before Dems take office in January.
Well, he's going to have to do it before. He doesn't have a choice, really.
Yeah, I mean, they can still subpoena the heck out of everyone in January, but for now, he could, while he's got both chambers in Republican hands, he should probably do it now if he's gonna, try this thing.
My thought was that if you look at who the players are, think Jerome Corsi, think WikiLeaks and think Roger Stone. Then even think Matt Drudge. It sounds to me like it has something to do with maybe stuff that was on Twitter that implicates all of them in this WikiLeaks, stealing of the thing, stealing the goods. Because this is what is this really about? This is about, going in and getting the stuff out of the DNC and Hillary campaign. That's what it sounds like to me. And Jill Stein, who everybody's questioned where she was coming from in the first place, fits into that. Anyway, keep your heads up. I don't like to do conspiracy theories, but
no. But yeah, she's like the Zelig of everyone.
Exactly. Perfect term, Matt. That was a good one. Okay, I do want to bring up the Khashoggi tape that everybody has been hearing. That clearly implicates the Saudi prince. And what does National Security Advisor Bolton come out with? No, it doesn't. Huh?
Yeah, I think tell your boss. That was the line, right? Tell your boss. That seemed fairly damning.
So what's with Bolton? I mean, Bolton's always been kind of an odd duck.
Well, he is. I mean, I think he's very focused on Iran. I think he wants to keep the Gulf State coalition against Iran together. I think from where he stands, the Saudis, waging war in Yemen and standing against the Iranians. And, I think he's happy with all that. I think he's willing to continue to give, MBS a lot of leeway because they certainly haven't really shown any interest in cracking down on MBS, the Saudi de facto ruler. So that's my guess of where, Bolton's coming from.
Just strange little sucker. I'm sure nobody else has called him a strange little sucker before. Just me. Okay, but speaking of him and going to the next thing, so the president goes to Paris.
Yes, and, does not appear at this ceremony on Saturday. Along with the other, allied leaders who were there. And, the White House story changes a couple of times. First they say, we couldn't go because of the rain. Then they say, the president wanted to go, but Secret Service wouldn't let him. I think it's clear from anyone who has knowledge of helicopters that, the conditions were not prohibitive. And even if they were, there's always backup plans on these trips.
Of course. It was his hair.
These, meteorologists from the military are all over these trips. I mean, I've been on a lot of presidential trips, and there's always alternative plans for all kinds of things, all kinds of contingencies. So the idea that he couldn't have gone. Now, was there something else? Did he just petulantly not want to go? Was there a threat? I don't know. But the idea that the helicopters couldn't get him there seems patently absurd.
Well, of course. And the fact that it was his hair, that also seems patently absurd as well. But the optic that afternoon of Merkel and Macron together. And you know what I thought, Matt? I thought how odd that Merkel and Macron are on the right side of history at the moment, and Trump and Putin are on the wrong side of history. Yeah. And how ironic. Yeah.
And then you didn't go to Arlington.
Well,
National Cemetery on Monday for Veterans Day.
Right. Something horrible happened. I think I think it has to do with Mueller or somebody being indicted, and he got wind, and he's freaked out beyond all imagination. That's my my take.
I mean, going to Arlington is like just
takes 2 seconds.
And that's a standard presidential ritual. I mean, it's just. First of all, it's like an easy layup. It's not, like you get points on the board for not doing anything except placing a wreath. It's not hard. It's about 3 minutes from your house.
Yeah. So what's the deal? So, like I said, I think something's wrong.
I mean, I thought that was even weirder than Paris.
Right. Okay. All right. Looking in my notes, it was Jim Acosta CNN lawsuit against the White House. That's who Ted Olson's working for.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I think it's Ted Boutros who's doing that one.
No, I heard Ted Olson. I heard it was Ted Olson. Right.
Okay. Well, they're the same.
So I got the two stories confused, folks.
They were actually my lawyers.
Right. Oh, really? Ago. Oh, yeah. On your wonderful case. We should do a show just on that. You almost wound up in the pokey, honey.
In the pokey, I know. I may get PTSD if we do that. But yeah.
We're going to do that. We're going to do a segment on that because that's a hell of a story. That's my favorite. One of my favorite stories, and it's historical. And there's a new movie coming out. You know about this movie, right? On Your Buddy, on Vice President.
The Dick Cheney movie. Yeah,
I saw parts of it.
Looks terrific.
Did you see? Oh my God. Oh my God! Yeah, we'll do something around that. We'll bring, because Matt's famous, folks. In case you didn't know, and one of the best journalists in the world too. But he's famous. Look it up. Oh, my buddy Matt! I would have had to come down and bail you out. Oh my God! The Jim Acosta CNN lawsuit against the White House. Here's the deal. It's an important thing, and I think it is fascinating that most attorneys, including these conservative attorneys, think that they got a First Amendment case here. And the White House and they also brought the lawsuit against the girl who took the mic, I think, away. But hello, this is really kind of interesting, don't you think?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, how substantive their legal claim is, but I think it's good they're pushing back. So, more power to them.
All right. Another quick story. Hate crimes are up for the third year in a row, 17%. Listen to this stat, though. Anti-Semitic crimes are up 37% this year. Ouch.
Yeah, that's definitely disturbing.
But if we're doing percentages, you want to hear another one?
Yeah.
The deficit rose 60% this year. 60%.
Yeah, well, this is what happens when you cut revenue. Funny thing, you keep spending the same amount or more, and then you cut revenue. Yeah.
I bring it up because these are really two bad stats. And we get back to the people who are sticking with old Trumpy baby, hook, line, and sinker. I can't tell you how many Trumpsters say to me, well, look, he made $1 gazillion. He did it for him. He's going to do it for the country. He's going to do it for me. Hello? He's putting the country in the same bankruptcy that he declared 55,000 times in his young career,
Yeah, I mean, he did lose money on a casino.
And the only person in the world, by the way, who that ever happened to.
Yeah, I mean, we know now how much he got from his father, or seem to know, and if he just put it in a index fund.
Yeah. I mean, he should, I think I read somewhere that if he just sat on it and done nothing, he would have been a gazillion.
Yeah, just put in Vanguard.
Right, anyway. So is today a great day for us to demand his tax returns? We going to see him, you think?
I'm sure he's going to litigate not to hand them over to the House committees that will surely ask for them, and whether he can sustain that, I don't know, and whether he'd comply with the court if he lost, I don't know. I think we're in for a big battle on that, because that's just one of those things he's been absolute about.
Top candidates for 2020, Biden, Sanders, O'Rourke, Avenatti is down to 0%. I don't think we have to comment on that. I just thought I'd throw that out there on our first show after the midterms, folks. And I think it's an interesting statistic. But we're going to close on two things. John Kelly, Kirstjen Nielsen, Homeland Security.
Right, the lovable duo.
And First Lady Melania Trump, who I am now calling the female brat of the Trump duo. This girl opened up a mouth, and John Bolton's deputy, Mira Ricardo, is escorted out of the White House, maybe. There's some conflicting as we were going to tape on that, but it looks like she was. Melania also said she was proud to say she wouldn't reach out to Michelle Obama. What the hell's going on with the First Lady?
It's really, it's kind of beyond me, because she's, again, like going to Arlington, there are certain kind of no-brainers for a first lady, and one is like you're sort of nice to the other first ladies, and you're kind of a small club, and doesn't mean you have to hang out with them, but that's to at least be the appearance of cordiality, and there's sort of none of that happening. And then, I don't know. I mean, she went after this Bolton deputy who tried to, fly on her plane and have a role in her Africa trip. And between that and wearing that jacket that said, I don't care, I mean, it's,
petulant little thing.
It's petulant, but, this is what we see from the president all the time. So,
Well, water seeks its own level. I just think that people were so willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. Where they attacked Ivanka, and said she was complicit, everybody thought, well, the one who's going to keep him in line is going to be Melania. And Melania may be the worst of it all, and I'm not sure she doesn't fuel Trump. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think when the history books are written, she will not prove to have been a benign influence or a positive one, the way, Nancy Reagan emerged as.
Right.
I mean, she had her critics at the time, but I think history's been much kinder.
Well, she had class. Nancy.
Yeah.
Nancy had class. I'll tell you, there was a picture of Melania, Putin, and Trump that they caught, and Melania's kind of sitting in the back, and she's got this. She's wearing this dress. If it had an epaulets on it, but it had I think it had gold buttons. Maybe it was just the way I was seeing it, and I tweeted, "She looks like she's a Putin spy." I mean, she looks like if it was a 1954, movie. After the war. What did they used to...
Russia with Love.
Yeah, I mean, honest to God, she had this look on her face and she had this outfit on. I just looked at her and went, oh my God, what if she's Putin's babe, really? I don't know. There's something not kosher there. I'm not... This is my conspiracy theory show.
But she was a Slovenian plant during the Cold War.
Wasn't her father in the Communist Party? People don't want to talk about that, but he was. He was a...
Well, they were occupied. I mean,
he was a member
so was Merkel,
well, she grew up in the East Germany. I mean, that was different.
Well, she grew up under, Tito. I mean,
she was only a kid, though.
The father was
The father was an operative. I mean, that's just not a story people want to tell.
Like KGB, but yeah. Well,
I know.
Poor Baron.
Yeah, poor kid doesn't stand a chance. Only other thing I got is a quick nod to Monica Lewinsky again, who is out there now. There's a film being done about her coming out.
Right.
She was out there saying, if she saw Hillary, she would apologize again, and the president ought to apologize, because if he would apologize, he'd feel so much better. And so we mentioned her. That's about all we can do. So that's my program. Anything for you? Talk to me. Anything you were thinking, saying, Halli, I needed to tell you this.
Halli, I hope the election is over next week. I hope we have all our counting done.
No, they just extended the Palm Beach to the 20th.
Okay,
we're going to tape
next week.
It's been extended.
Okay.
But so leave me with something so that I can think about it for the rest
I
of the week.
want to see Trump pardoning the turkey. It's the annual presidential ritual, pardoning the turkey. Can he handle it? I can't remember what he did last year.
I can't either, but, one turkey to the next.
Exactly.
God, I'm bad. I'm terribly bad. Well, Matthew.
Halli, next week.
Next week, John. You were listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show posts new podcast Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern at HalliCasser-Jayne.com and is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Be sure to find me on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, on all your favorite apps. You can also find the Halli Casser-Jayne Show on your Alexa device. Just say, the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Oh, and come play with me on Twitter at the Halli CJ Show. Consider this. For 167 years, the New York Times has been in the forefront of political reporting. From memorable campaigns and elections to controversial legislation, scandals, and issues ranging from immigration, race, and gender to the economy and war. In today's turbulent times, the New York Times newspaper's political coverage is more relevant than ever, not only for the news itself, but because of the paper's leadership in defending the freedom of the press, our freedom being sincerely challenged in the age of Trump. In the new Book of Politics, 167 Years of Covering the State of the Union, noted former New York Times editorial board editor Andrew Rosenthal has compiled an anthology that explores the newspaper's broad scope of unparalleled political coverage and examines what has changed over the decades and how history has, often dramatically, repeated itself in surprising ways. With a foreword by acclaimed columnist Maureen Dowd, including 60 photographs as well as reproductions of front-page stories, here are the noteworthy political articles from the New York Times archives that are sure to engross readers. Let's talk with Andrew Rosenthal.
Hi, Halli.
Hi, Andrew. How are you?
I'm excellent. How are you?
I'm glad this week is almost over, darling. That's what I'm telling you, right? And I'm sure you're feeling the same way.
This is one of those weeks when I'm glad I retired from daily journalism. So.
I'm not so lucky, darling. I'm not so lucky. But listen, I'm so happy.
But you probably have to make sense of it.
Yeah, I'm trying. And you know what? Some days are better than others. Some minutes are better. But some seconds are better than others. And I'm down in Florida, so I can tell you what. Oh, boy. Oh, boy. 2 recounts coming. Yeah. Anyway, listen, Hanukkah came early for me this year. This is really a wonderful book. Great idea. I don't know who came up with the idea. I am serious about that. I keep showing it to everybody.
The Times came up with the idea.
Right?
I'll admit the Times came up with the idea.
They're smart.
But what amazed me when they asked me to do it was like, you haven't done this already?
Yeah,
I was
right.
quite taken aback.
I hear you. I absolutely hear you.
But it was very exciting.
Well, and it is very exciting, and it's really, really an important book right now, I think and we'll get into why I think it's so important. But the book covers stories from 1856 to 2018, and what a gargantuan task. I mean, you did this, or did you have a team doing this, or what were the criteria? Talk to me about that.
Well, the research was done by myself and my wife, Mary Beth, who is a former lawyer and Capitol Hill staffer and lobbyist who knows a ton about politics and is a great researcher. So it was really the two of us. And the first thing we had to do was eliminate the impossible, which was we couldn't do it chronologically and it couldn't be comprehensive. Just not possible, right? Mm-hmm. So we decided to come up with themes, presidential elections, wars, economy, things that really mattered that we could then focus on and provide the ability for readers to go in and look at those things and see them as they were unfolding, by witnesses to the events and also through the prism of the eyes of the newspaper. And I think what you're left with is 100 and whatever years it was of trying pretty damn hard to be fair.
Right. That is true. But as I said, going back and looking at some of this stuff really is eye-opening. The stories just tell you so much about then. I like the way that you can apply it to now, though, I'm interested in the political side of all of this, of course. But we tend to think about politics in terms of the politics of our times. But there's, as I said, lessons in a broader sense. What's changed over the years in terms of just the Times political coverage? What do you think? How has that evolved or changed?
Yeah, several things. I mean, in the beginning, it's all very, just the facts, ma'am, kind of an approach, and that starts to ease. There is a comprehensiveness to it. The Times' coverage of the New Deal was incredible. Really just every aspect of it, and it wasn't like they were necessarily on the side of Roosevelt. In fact, the Times editorially opposed Roosevelt, but the coverage was amazing. Then one of the really big changes happens around McCarthy, and then civil rights and Vietnam. And the appearance of television, obviously, too, where suddenly everything changes. And you're not just covering he said, she said stuff anymore. You're covering matters of life and death and incredible importance. And getting at the truth is really hard. And it created kind of the relationship between government and press, as envisioned by Thomas Jefferson, was meant to be adversarial. It wasn't. We're not supposed to be friends. But it gets more and more and more adversarial as you start to go through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and so on. And now, of course, it's at a kind of a fever pitch. The other thing that's really interesting about the political coverage, and it sort of coincides with the same era, sort of around Nixon, is, and also Watergate, of course, made everybody doubt the government because we just couldn't help it, right? But around that time, too, we started focusing on the character of the president and not just his actions, who he was, what drove him, what motivated him, what was his family like, what did he do for fun. And it's a real change, and I kind of attribute it to the Nixon fall. It's like, how could this brilliant man be such an idiot, And so what caused that? And, of course, everybody now we're in the age of celebrity where everyone's dying to know everything about individuals. But you really see that, these really interesting portraits. Hal Raines wrote this amazing piece about how Ronald Reagan went from being, a movie actor to being president of the United States. And it was full of information and insight and wit and charm. And it's one of these things you start it and you just can't stop until you're done. And Maureen Dowd is also, who wrote the foreword for the book, is one of the great profilers of politicians that you're ever going to read. She just really understands them. And
one of my favorites.
And she's great. She just has a way of getting at the thing about them that you're like, of course, that's what it is.
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
And I find that fascinating.
So do I. So, this is interesting because certainly we're in that age of celebrity now, but I'm curious about one thing. FDR, for instance, he was the mastermind of putting out who he was and building his character for the world to see. We didn't have TVs in those days, so it was all by voice. I do voice. I appreciate that. I understand how much harder, by the way, that is. But it's curious to me about this. Today, I mean, look at Trump. I mean, another mastermind of what he wants to be put out there. Does the press buy into it, or as you said, now is it so have to be adversarial because you know what? You both have the bully pulpit. The Times has. So does the White House.
Right. I think, you mentioned Roosevelt, and that's interesting because, we sort of never mentioned the fact that he had polio.
Right. He didn't want you to.
And the press cooperated with the White House's PR in those days. There was a sense of community then, I think, that starts to fray, and probably the fraying is not a bad thing because, just because the elites agree with each other is not necessarily a recipe for happiness for the rest of humanity, right?
Right. Yeah.
But now, it's just impossible. You just can't. And the problem now, too, is that the press is that this is a president who has just seized control of the news cycle in a way that we've never seen before. Reagan, with his vaunted image masters and stuff, wasn't even remotely as successful because he didn't have Twitter. And the question now is, if you're running a newspaper or you're reporting for one, do you report every single thing that the president says every single day? Or do you not? And I covered the White House for 4 years under Bush Sr., and I would probably say 75 or 80% of what the president did in a given day I never once wrote about.
So why are we?
But this guy does.
Yeah, right. But why is the press playing into it? Because I think it does. They don't know how to play him. They don't know how to edit. They need you. What?
I think that there's several reasons for that. One is because he dominates it. The other is that the medium that he uses is just so powerful. I'm talking about Twitter, right?
Yeah.
And the other is that it's just increasingly hard, especially when you're under assault, to say, what, I'm not going to do that. Was it Huffington Post who said they weren't going to cover Trump when he was a candidate? I mean, that's sort of ridiculous. You can't. Because it's not up to us to decide what news we think we should. I mean, yes, you make decisions and you make choices. But if there's a gigantic national movement and we're not reporting that, that's a gigantic failing of the press.
Yeah. I hear you.
Even if we don't like it.
I just had that conversation, by the way, about the thing with what's going on with CNN and whether people are saying, well, just don't show up and don't report. And I'm like, no, that's not the press's job. The press's job is to be there. Somebody's got to figure out what you're going to put out, but the press has to be there. Even if you take a knee, but you have to be there. I asked you about what was different, right? I asked you what was different. Well, what's the same? I bet you people aren't asking you. I'm curious as if there's anything that's the same that hasn't changed.
Yeah, I think when you account for the Times, and I don't mean the New York Times, but our time, and you account for the changes in evolution in American English, I think what the New York Times has done for these 167 years is provide a really thorough, intelligently written, almost entirely dispassionate, and really interesting and gripping account of American politics. And that has been the case all along. The people with emojis did not invent casual conversation. The Times was, it had its pomposities, of course, but there was a lot of amazing writing. If you read Roy Reid's account of the Selma violence with the attack on the protesters in Selma, Alabama, it's poetic, both in its spareness and its unsparingness, and its spareness of language and its absolutely unsparing depiction of what was going on. You read it and you feel threatened and you feel like you're just shocked. And he dictated this off the top of his head on a payphone.
I'm fascinated that you brought that up because it is one thing I wanted to ask you about, and that's this. We forget that reporters are also writers, right? And there's a great there's a remarkable amount of skill that goes into it. Some more poetic than others. How about that? Because writing changes, and how writing changes, does that change how we report?
I think it changes how we read rather than how we report. I think that the Times has been striving truly since the mid-1960s to kind of shed some of the stuffiness and become more conversational, and that's accelerated recently, and that's generally speaking a good thing. But you can't trade in speed for accuracy, and you can't trade in a sort of accessible language for depth. You have to have both. And it's a very hard thing to do. I know lots of reporters who aren't great writers. I know lots of writers who aren't great reporters. I know people who are both, but it's very tricky. And the answer to that is write in plain, simple, understandable English. And also leave out your opinions if you're writing a news story. That's my own personal advocacy, but I lost that.
I was going to say, is there any of that left?
Yeah, there is. There is. I think, there's a lot of attitude and opinion in political coverage, but, I don't think anybody covers the world, certainly not in the United States. I mean, BBC does, but the New York Times' coverage of parts of the world that you should care about but never heard of is amazing. And, we have reporters, we have American reporters who are risking their lives, but there are journalists all over the world that are risking their lives to bring basic information to people so they can make decisions. And people undervalue that.
Oh, absolutely. Having been a foreign correspondent, I can tell you that people do undervalue that. Andrew, listen, I want to ask you this. I want to ask you about who politicians are today. Less altruistic, more narcissistic. Maybe they're kinder and gentler than we're giving them credit for because one is coloring everything that we look at. And what are your thoughts there?
I don't think it's possible to become president of the United States without having a nice, healthy streak of narcissism. I mean, at some point you have to sit down and say to yourself, I want to be the leader of the free world. I mean, that's crazy, right? So there is that, and that goes back. I think what we've lost, and in some ways George Bush Sr. was the last of this, is sort of people who felt that serving the public in government was a virtue and not a performance art. I think Obama has some of that. I think there are other people. There are plenty of members of Congress that are there because they're trying to do the right thing and they're trying to do good and they're trying to represent their constituents. But it's been overtaken by politics as show. And that's partly television, it's partly 24-hour-a-day television, it's partly the internet, and it's partly the technology of politics, and it's also the lack of scruple. There's been a lot of really negative trends in American politics in the last half a century that were undertaken. I'm telling you, the Republican Southern strategy in the 1970s and 80s was to use hidden messages of racism to drive people away from the Democratic Party.
Well,
and to use voter
that hasn't
suppression.
Changed.
No.
Not down here.
No, they've just gotten better at it.
Right.
They've just gotten better at it. And you know what? We have a huge problem with voter suppression in this country. It is nothing compared to what happened right after the Civil War and right after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, those situations were far worse. We never talk about this really much in our country, but the number of people who were lynched and murdered by racist mobs in this country is staggering, and the number of people who are actually called to account for it, you can count on one hand. Times have been worse.
Well,
they have been.
Yeah, of course. But I'm going to ask you this then. But as you researched this book, as you went through all of these stories, are there patterns in American politics and American history that you see repeating over and over?
Yes, many. One of them is that politicians on both parties make the same mistakes about the economy over and over and over and over again. And, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing multiple times. I mean, how many times are we going to cut taxes to raise wages? It never happens, right?
Right.
The other thing that happens in this country is that every time there is social progress, there is backlash. And there was a racist backlash after the Civil War. There was a racist backlash after choosing race because it's so dramatic. There was a racist backlash after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. There was huge eruptions of bigotry in this country after marriage laws were passed. And when Barack Obama was elected, there was a massive racist backlash in this country that politicians who I believe are lacking in the ethics department have taken advantage of for their own personal gain. And don't forget that the business of national politics in this country is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. People make fortunes off of elections, and elections are not as expensive if they're easy.
I hear you. I absolutely do hear you. So now I'm going to ask you something about New York Times readers. You're as an editor, you know who your reader is. Has the reader changed? Is the reader less naive, more naive, less susceptible, more susceptible? What's going on with your readers and how you give them what maybe you think they need, or give them, or just try and be fair and maybe it doesn't matter? I don't know. What about the reader?
I think the readers have become more detached from the Times. I mean, there's still plenty of loyal Times readers, but there's so much source of information now, and so many people take what organizations like the New York Times does and regurgitate it on their own websites that the readers there's a kind of distance was built in there. We allowed a reluctance to pay for it to grow up by not charging for it online, and that's become a problem. And convincing our readers that what we do has real value to them and that they should be willing to invest some of their money in it is tricky. There is also a lack of attention, and I think that most of the time that you see a comment on a particular article, the chances that the commenter has actually read that article are very small.
Wow, they're reading headlines.
And so they read headlines, they read somebody else's Facebook post about it,
right.
They read somebody else's representation of the article, and there's a whole sub-industry in the media of people who deliberately misrepresent what other people say and then attack their own version of it. So that's a problem, and our readers have just become, they're being bombarded with information. And we haven't found a really good way of getting young people to become news readers in any kind of a systematic way, and that's troublesome. It used to be the newspaper was on your table in the morning, and your dad was reading it, or he'd be talking about it. That just doesn't happen anymore.
Right. And I think that's a big problem.
And,
go ahead. Do you have something else? Oh, go ahead, because I have something else, too, I wanted to ask you. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that they expect us to reach out to them more than we ever did before. They expect us to be more accessible, and they want us to pay attention to them more than they ever did before. And I think that that's a good thing, and I think we should be responsive to it.
Where I was going to go with it is this. I wonder whether the other problem is this quote-unquote fake news. Now, the Trump's fake news is not what I'm talking about, because
Trump's fake news doesn't exist.
Thank you. So let's not even go there. But stories that are in the Times, I see it on Facebook all the time. I see it on Twitter all the time. I see stuff that your team comes out with, and it's just bastardized, like within 5 minutes. Used in a wrongful way. How do you combat that?
You have to join in the same, forms of communication that they do. The Times has to be on Twitter, and the Times has to be on Facebook, and the Times has to be on Instagram, or wherever the cool kids are going these days. And we have to respond. We can't just sit back and think, oh, well, people will come around and they'll read the article and they'll understand this isn't true. You sometimes have to be proactive. And I have seen that happening in some admirable ways. The other thing is we need people who are willing to invest in journalism. And I will say that I think one of the best things that's happened to American journalism in the last 20 years is Jeff Bezos.
Yeah.
Who took hundreds of millions of dollars of his own money and has brought the Washington Post back to life with amazing editors. The editor of the Washington Post, Marty Barron, is a brilliant journalist. But he gave him money and told him to fix it. And that's an amazing thing, And we always benefited over the decades in this country from rich people who bought newspapers out of vanity but then invested in them. And that's dying. And people expect, people who invest expect constantly increasing profit margins and large profit margins, and you can't run a newspaper with large profit margins. It just cannot be done. So not of the kind that Wall Street expects.
Right. So you go and you do all this research, and you've had an interesting life, Andrew. And your father was the storied New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning editor, Abe Rosenthal. You were weaned on the news, for God's sakes, and you've seen this business from inside out, which gives you such a remarkable perspective for all of us. What are you worried? Are you hopeful? Are you what? Where are you on all of this? Because entertainment.
I'm worried,
news,
but
yeah. Go ahead.
I'm worried, but I'm not. I haven't given up. I think that there are enormous financial challenges to the news industry that we have to overcome, and I think there are enormous other kinds of challenges. I worry as I see a lot of what is supposed to be news reporting become more personal and more opinionated. I don't think that helps us with people. When we try to say that we are impartial and a reporter who wrote a tough article about Donald Trump is trashing him on Twitter, that undermines the credibility of the article. Or even worse, when opinion is inserted into them, and I hope that we find ways of combating that. We also have to slow down a little bit. We have come up with this notion that there's a trade-off between speed and accuracy. Look, I worked for Wire Service for 10 years, and Wire Services did live journalism when they did it by carrier pigeon. And there is no trade-off between speed and accuracy. You have to be fast and you have to be right. And it's not easy, but it can be done by people of goodwill who are willing to put in the work, and for not very much financial reward, I should say. Most journalists are extremely underpaid.
That goes without saying. But politicians and journalists, as opposed to politics, that relationship, how has that changed over 167 years? And What are we going to do? I'm thinking about that Tucker Carlson thing where you take on the role of a provocateur and you're met with the provoked on your back door. That's one instance. You know, what they just did to Jim Acosta. New York Times folks have, taken it on the chin. You see him beaten up on Twitter all day long. What about that thing, though, between the politician and the journalist?
It's become more and more poisonous. And it's become particularly true about the right side of the politics and journalism. Most journalists, honestly, are liberal-minded, at least, and many of them are true liberals. And so there's a natural built-in thing. There's a natural built-in state of I've lost the word here. I've used it 100 times today, but and not animosity, but we're not friends with the politicians. It wasn't envisioned that way. We were supposed to be the fourth estate. That's what Thomas Jefferson said. But it's gotten more and more and more poisonous, and it starts really. It's easy to find it in modern times with Watergate.
Yeah.
When the faith in the president was shattered for so many people, but the response was anger from his supporters and the attack on the press. The press did not invent Watergate. Richard Nixon did. The press just reported on it.
Well, I think that's,
the United States did not. The press did not decide to invade Iraq, botch it, and create ISIS. That was George Bush. We just reported it, and people often get angry. People say, "Why is the news so negative?" Well, news is negative. The fact that 300 million people lived through the day is not news. The fact that 27 of them were murdered in a nightclub or whatever the number was, that's news. So it tends to be negative, and that could be it can be wearying. And when you're bombarded by your elected officials and your local media and your church and everybody else with, it's not just that they're wrong, they're bad people. It's very hard to get past that.
Yeah, and I think it brings up the other thing about that, and that is we have to stop thinking that newspaper people make the news. They report the news. And, when you have wily politicians, they can create the bad reported news. So it always looked like it's negative. I mean, that's the part that people don't want to understand. Yes. It's coming out, it's being brought down from the bully pulpit. Just as we leave, are we leaving on an optimistic or a pessimistic note? But before you answer that, let me just give you credit, not only for a wonderful book. I love the New York Times. I've always loved the New York Times. I grew up in reading that paper with my mom and dad every morning. I will say this, it also is one of the best local papers ever. And I miss local news because we're not doing that online. You just can't do it. It just isn't there. It's, and I think that's part of the community problem that we have right now in the adversarial positions we have. But are you optimistic, pessimistic? We can go forward and
I am optimistic because I have to be. And, the more I've been worked on this book and the more I've been talking about it, the more I realize that there is a great tradition of journalism in this country. And we have survived a lot. We survived Joe McCarthy. We survived lynchings. We survived, the attacks during the war in Vietnam. We survived all of this stuff, and we can survive Donald Trump. But we have to hang in there, and we can't turn ourselves into adversaries. We can't turn ourselves into participants in this kind of political savagery. We have to stand back a little bit, and we have to be willing to take a lot of heat.
A lot of heat. Thank you, Andrew. Wonderful. I hear you, buddy. Thank you so much. What a delight to talk to you. Great book. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Halli.
I've been speaking with Andrew Rosenthal. His book is The New York Times Book of Politics, 167 Years of Covering the State of the Union. To purchase the book, visit Amazon.com. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is a production of Resec, LLC. Be sure to tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at HalliCasser-Jayne.com or listen on your favorite app. New podcasts are posted Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern.